Great, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Strategic Outlook on Africa. My name is Nairi Woods and I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. And it's a pleasure to see you all, and I'm going to be calling on you, so please already start thinking what you'd like to ask during this session, looking at Africa and our outlook for it. The theme for this year's Davos has been Africa Rising in a Fractured World. And we're very lucky to have four of the wisest heads from the continent to take us through some issues on that. I'd like first to introduce them and to give you a menu of the issues that they think are most important for Africa this coming year. So if I could start, Winnie Binyamina, by asking you, you're now UN Under-Secretary General, head of UNAIDS, but you've had a long career, distinguished career, working across the continent, having grown up in Uganda. What's the number one issue for you?
For Africa now, I am worried that we are entering a period of austerity, and we are seeing drops in social spending, and we're going to get ourselves into the cycle of stagnation of the 80s and 90s if we don't find a way out of the debt, a coordinated way out of the debt that we are in now. Half of African countries are now either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. So we need to find a coordinated way out to restructure debt and have the space to continue building on the social gains that we've made so far.
Thank you, Winnie. So debt and austerity and how to protect social spending. That's item one on our agenda. Can I turn to Sipho Pityana? Sipho, you're chairman of Anglo Gold Ashanti. We've now gone from Uganda down to South Africa. Yeah. What's the number one issue you would put on the Outlook agenda?
Well, I think that the African continent is faced with a challenge of what it contributes to world economic growth, which is stagnant. And if we look at a comparative analysis of where Asia was and where Africa is today, Asia, as a contributor in the past 10 years, accounts for 50% of the world's growth, China 25%, and that's driven largely as a result of its deficit in development in those and creating opportunities for investment. Africa finds itself in a similar position. So the question that I think African leaders should ask themselves is what it would take to be a catalyst for world's growth, and using Africa as a platform for that.
So growth.
Yeah.
Number two on our agenda. Let me move to Natasha Mwanza from Zambia. Natasha, Natasha is a child and women's rights activist in Zambia, and she'll tell us more about that. But what's your number one agenda item?
Just to go on with what he said about the growth issue, I believe one of the greatest issues that Africa is facing right now is we're having an increasing population of the working age that is less than the dependent age. So you find that there's so many young people in Africa right now, and yet they're not as supported as they ought to be. They're not as equipped, and they're not as invested in as they ought to be for them to actually promote to the growth and development of Africa. And so I feel like that's one of the greatest challenges that we're having. We have so many young people with potential in Africa, and yet there's not enough being done to ensure that they explore that potential and actually utilize that potential.
Fantastic, the potential of young people. And finally, just to finish the introductions of our panelists, Bryant Orjiako, whose initials are A.B.C, most memorable initials ever, chairman of Seplat Petroleum in Nigeria. Bryant, what's number one on your agenda?
Energy insufficiency in Africa. These challenges where a continent has over 600 million people without electricity, for me, is the biggest challenge towards economic growth in the continent.
And chimes well with this year's theme at Davos on climate change. Okay, so the panelists are proposing this agenda to us with these four items: energy and meeting the needs of people across the continent, growth and ensuring the continent takes a leap in growth, austerity, debt and protecting social spending, and young people, the potential of young people and their health. Is that all of your agenda? Does anyone have anything else that they think should be the number one thing on the Outlook agenda? This is to the audience now. Yes?
Finance and infrastructure.
Finance and infrastructure. which I think is probably part of Sipo's story.
Yeah.
But thank you, sir. Anyone else?
This.
Yes. Inequality. There's a big nod from my left here.
Yeah.
Yes. Corruption. Wow.
Ease of doing business.
Ease of doing business. Any other elements?
Very active
Yes.
audience.
Making businesses more resilient.
Yeah.
Resilience of business. Great. Okay, well, you've given us a big agenda. Last one. Digital technology. Okay. Terrific. Well, I'd like then to, let's start with the upside of this equation. Let's start with growth and the ambition for growth. So, Sipo, what would your big hope be for 2020? What could we hope to achieve over the next year that would set the stage for a brilliant decade for the continent?
Well, when I came here, I had set ideas. And now you opened it up and you've messed up our agenda by having other people say something. No, I think that, clearly I think that there are lessons for us to learn from Asia. Because as an emerging continent with several countries, remarkably, China is full of very interesting lessons for us. A country that is bigger than our continent in terms of population size had the benefit of it being an integrated entity with ease of movement of people and goods, with opportunities for investment in infrastructure that would have a multiplier effect. And if you look at the African continent, every time we think about infrastructure investment, we think about infrastructure in a country. And the limitations that come with that investment are obvious. So we need to think continentally, whether we think investment, whether we think about trade and all of that. Major drawback for the continent is the seriousness with which it takes its borders. Our borders are too hard. We need to soften our borders. We need to enable ease of movement of goods and services, of capital, and all of those. So this is an opportunity for, one of the major reasons that account, by the way, for the world's subdued growth is lack of investment, not just in Africa, but across the world. But the developmental deficit of the African continent is an opportunity to attract investment, assuming that you have appropriate regulatory and policy frameworks that enable that to happen. So if you want to invest in transport infrastructure in Africa, you're probably more attracted to look at a combination of countries, because that would scale up opportunities for use of that infrastructure than in one country. So it's those things that I think, as a result, among other things, of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we should unleash to look at how we build on this to drive that growth and attract investment.
So just on that specific issue, lower borders.
Yeah.
And you're right, we've got the Continental Free Trade Agreement, we've got the Trade Facilitation Agreement globally. What do you hope to see over this year? What's your most optimistic outlook on lowering borders? Do you think we're going to see any progress this coming year?
Well, Natasha's focusing on health at the Africa World Economic Forum session in Cape Town this year. Somebody said, mosquitoes know no borders. And we need to think about that. We need to think about this notion of shared infrastructure. So I hope when we have a reflection of the Africa Free Trade Agreement in the middle of the year this year, our African leaders will take stock of how much they've done to soften the borders.
Anyone else with a specific view, either from the panel or the audience, on a specific measure that you hope that you'll see taken this coming year on the continent of Africa that will lower borders?
Immigration policies is a major problem in Africa. There is absolutely no way Africa continent can really progress with intra-Africa trade, with all of the barriers in movements of the people. It really beats my imagination that Africa countries impose very difficult regulatory requirements for Africans to move within Africa. I cannot go to South Africa without a visa. South Africans cannot come to Nigeria without a visa. And yet, people from Europe, Asia, go into these African countries without visa. I think the African leaders must address this. Otherwise, the whole free trade narrative will be a joke.
So what would you like to see in Nigeria?
I'd like to see where those regulatory framework are completely overhauled to make it a lot easier for African citizens to move freely in Africa, in and out of Nigeria. And that's the way to begin to drive quite a lot of businesses, especially even in the informal sectors, so that people will see goods and movement moving very freely across the borders.
Fantastic. So does anyone have a positive story of lowering borders on the continent? Come on, there are examples. Does anyone want to venture one? There we go, brave lady.
I'm from Mali, so we are already in a form of free trade agreement with the ECOWAS, and we've had it for some time within that environment, and it has worked well, particularly when we are engaging across SMEs and across bigger investment and SMEs companies. Just to touch a bit upon a positive note on what would be driving growth as well and creating the resilience in our economies, it's how much we spend in fostering and strengthening our SMEs. That has had a positive impact within our different countries. And I think within the broader free trade agreement, we'll have to look at the positive for the companies that have more industrialization compared to the ones that are in transition.
Great. I'm going to take that point. I think that's a nice. Did you have a point on that one, Winnie? No.
I have a concern. I think that even if we open these borders, unless we are seriously restructuring our economies, we are not likely to make a lot of headway. Look at growth in Africa in the last 10 years. It has been good figures of growth, some countries even making 10% and more. But where was that growth coming from? It was coming from exporting our raw commodities, digging a hole in the ground, taking out oil or gold and selling it abroad. That doesn't create many jobs. That doesn't, even if you open borders, it's only one route for the oil. So really, we needed to have spent that money investing it in sectors that create many jobs, that empower people, like health, like education, like agriculture, like tourism. But we missed that. We said we want to put it in infrastructure, which is fine. But now, what is happening now? We are in low growth, and in the period of low growth, it's also time to pay back the big loans that we took.
So, Winnie, is your concern that if we open borders to immigration, you'll just create social conflict?
No.
Is that the concern?
No. We should open the borders, but I'm saying it's not enough. It's simply not enough.
Right.
You may open the borders, but you need to stimulate the economy in those sectors that give people many jobs. And we haven't done that. And the opportunity was when we had high growth, commodity prices were high, we didn't do that. Now, it is also time to pay back the loans. And that's why now my concern is that, like in the last 3 years, if I can give an example, a country like Kenya in the last 3 years, health spending dropped by 9%, debt repayments went up by almost 200%. It's worse in Zambia. Zambia, in the last 3 years, health spending went down by 27%, and debt repayments by almost 800%. So we are entering a very difficult period, and our governments are very quietly cutting budgets and cutting where the poor are and where ordinary people are. So we might open all these borders, but where will we get the empowered people and the stimulation in the sectors that can bring jobs? So my concern is there.
Thank you. There's a gentleman behind you with a quick comment.
Our company financed the largest ever non-recourse project in Africa. It's a $4.4 billion refinery in Egypt without government guarantees. I think that's the model to go. And I share very much what Madam Winnie is saying about that. I think there is also a big problem with the expectation of leaders within the continent regarding shiny, gold-plated infrastructure. And this is, everyone wants the newest trains, everybody wants the newest, I don't know what, airport, etc., and nobody figured out really how they're going to pay for all of this, unless they have no intention of paying.
So,
Yeah.
did you have any government guarantee or multilateral guarantee?
Zero.
You put your
Totally
4.4 billion.
non-recourse. Totally non-recourse on the project. Even we refused to give a guarantee on our company, which is Qara Holdings. So we totally refused to give any sort of guarantees. It was purely financed by the Japanese government, Korean government, and the European Investment Bank. And dare I say, if we were to do it today, we would not be able to finance it, because all of the climate concerns of the big donors who do not want to finance hydrocarbons project anymore. So European Investment Bank would not do this deal. They have just announced that they would phase out of all hydrocarbon financing starting 2021. So it is going to be much more difficult to finance infrastructure projects related to energy, and it is going to be extremely hard to finance projects in Africa because the debt levels are going to be quite high.
Thank you. So let's come now to Brian, who's put this issue of energy, infrastructure, and balancing it with the needs of people on the agenda. So what is it that you're hoping to see this coming year, Brian?
Frankly, in Africa, it's good to contextualize what the real figures are. 1.2 billion people, total power supply less than 200 megawatts. Just see that compared to even Canada, that is high. Per capita consumption of power in Africa is far below the global average of 2,500 kilowatt hour. Now, you see a very strong sense of urgency. Now, at the back of lack of power infrastructure, you begin to see the industries are not working. And I use Nigeria as a reference point. Nigeria is a country that over the years has relied on oil and gas as a means of revenue. I think the narrative should be for Nigeria to begin to look at gas and power as a major component of source of energy rather than source of revenue, and therefore use that as a launching pad to diversify the economy. Therefore, when you provide power, you would like to see the power firing the industries, you'd like to see the power encouraging more manufacturing industries springing up. You'd like to see power really energizing the SMEs that can manufacture and provide goods. When you do this, it will immediately impact unemployment. It will immediately impact security. It will immediately impact even what Winnie was talking about with respect to Africa really increasing productivity, such that when you look at the borders we're talking about, you now begin to see flow of meaningful goods and services rather than smuggling and all of that. So when you really look at the issues of energy in Africa, it requires urgency. Now, when I was speaking earlier on, I spoke about over 600 million people not having electricity. Now, obviously, you must begin to find solutions for this. And most times when we speak about power infrastructure, many people used to think about only grid power. Today, I believe that most of this population can very easily be reached through off-grid power. And in doing this, you can deploy gas, which is what we produce. You can also begin to tap the potentials in renewables. There's no reason why a lot of households in Africa cannot begin to tap into solar power that is available. Obviously, there will be some capital expenditure, but by the time you look at it, it will definitely provide the bridge that is needed. And then that will impact the economy.
And what's the obstacle to that lovely vision? You said as head of an energy company, what's in the way of getting there?
I think it's a number of things. One is regulatory framework. I believe that the governments in Africa will begin to see energy the way telecommunication has completely leapfrogged in the continent. We should begin to see a situation where the real policymakers begin to see that subsidy and regulation especially around tariffs and how much you charge in power, is not necessarily advantageous to the general population. What is important is to create the environment to attract the needed investments in this sector so that you now have competition driving the tariff rather than regulation driving the tariff. And this will make a whole lot of difference.
So what's that like for a company? You know, most of us here are not head of a company. And what I'm asking is, you talk about needing a new regulatory framework, but with your corporate hat on, you probably need to lobby to keep the status quo because you operate within it.
It's not really about lobbying. I'll give you an example with our company. My company, Seplat, started operations 10 years ago. We took assets that were operated by international oil companies, and we have since grown capacity within these assets in multiple fold. Not because we have better technology, but because we're more nimble, we have better need, and we're Nigerian companies. But then coming back to energy, and what I mean by regulatory framework, when we started this company 2010, what happened was cost of power has remained static. The cost of gas within Nigeria was less than 50 cents per 1,000 million scarf. Today, the government then changed all of that. So the domestic gas price in Nigeria has now equated to international Henry Hub price. And indeed, the domestic gas price is higher within the country than it is for transfer price to LNG. Therefore, that brought the incentive to invest. So a company such as ours then invested more than 90% of the revenue we made within the country to grow the gas capacity. That's really what the regulatory framework can do.
And what percentage of your company's revenue comes from exports?
Interestingly, today, when we started, very good question, when we started, almost 100% was export of crude oil. Today, it's about 50-50, gas and liquid hydrocarbon, but 50% is gas to the domestic market. So we really supply that and providing 30% of the domestic gas to power. But this is just one of them. And I'm sure the more I speak about this and you look at the narrative of climate change, a lot of people will begin to wonder what is really the position of hydrocarbon. And for a continent such as Africa, I think it's a matter of sitting down and really working out what is the balance between the need of the continent versus making sure that the climate change narrative is not compromised. And this is achievable in Africa.
And just on that issue, Sipo, because you're in the mining sector, this idea of Brian's that Africa's resources need to be used domestically to generate growth, what would that mean in your industry?
No, but it's spot on. I mean, just to go back to Winnie's point, you must remember that Africa's growth disarticulation, if you like, is a consequence of this export orientation. So the infrastructure we build is for markets outside of Africa. And as a consequence, we create enclaves of underdevelopment. We marginalize ourselves. So our inter-regional trade sitting at 18% compared to Europe's 70% speaks to the fact that our goods and services that our own domestic market is able to generate go stranded because they don't have markets. And we look for markets elsewhere. So we're busy running around trying to get everybody to buy our goods and services, and we don't have confidence in them. That's what it says. So part of the development trajectory and the catalytic role that the Africa Continental Trade Agreement is that it begins to get us to think about that. It's more than just an agreement on paper. What regulatory framework, what infrastructure is required, and what opportunities that offers in unleashing those collaborative ventures. Mosquitoes know no borders. Climate change also hits across borders. So it doesn't matter where the problem comes from, we all get affected. So we need to create platforms and opportunities for collaboration. So I mean, mining companies are known for this. We go to most underdeveloped parts of the continent. We are in Mali, we are in Guinea, we are in Ghana, and several parts of the African continent. And more often than not, we actually go in places which have absolutely no infrastructure. And curiously, by the way, we learn a lot from small-scale artisanal miners, whom governments deem illegal, because there's no regulatory framework. So a big player comes in and takes over and marginalizes them. But we learn from the lessons that they've had in actually providing requisite infrastructure to set up our operations.
So Sipho and Brian are depicting an Africa which will grow because of increased trade, consumption, energy as a source of growth within Africa, not from continued exports to the outside world. But I think it's fair to say that Natasha and Winnie, you're concerned with how you equip African people, young people, the whole populations, to actually rise, to be able to make the most of that. So, Natasha, what do you think? Do you share the same vision? And how does your concern with the potential of young people feed into it?
Well, I'm just sort of going to turn the conversation another way. And I like that someone had mentioned corruption, and this is sort of what everyone is talking about. For me, it seems like it's a big issue, and the center of this conversation really is around what, you know, we're talking about regulation and all those things, but then it's more of the leadership that we have in Africa and the power struggle that we also get it with. So we're talking about things like, you know, how they're investing in things that they're not supposed to invest in, and that's sort of on resource allocation. And we're trying to understand the best ways to actually prioritize what's the best place that's supposed to take all these monies to. And we believe that those decisions are done by the policy players, you know, our presidents, heads of states, and, you know, even perhaps the people who are even helping us with funds. But then it's just all about the power struggle. How exactly are we going to be able to influence them to understand what the needs of these young people are, or even just basically individuals in Africa? So for me, I think the major question here is how do we get to a place where we get to influence these people who hold positions of power, but get them to realize that we as Africans have that power ourselves. And then also, it also goes down to, I love how everyone is talking about, resource allocation. And I think one important conversation we should learn to have is around social accountability. Be it in the health sector, be it in education sectors. We all have heard policymakers, we all have heard decision makers, politicians making promises and saying they're going to do this and that, but then holding them to their word is something that we don't always see happening. And I think that's a major issue. If we look at, say, you know, what they say they're going to do or they're going to distribute on a national budget, for instance, and what's actually on the ground, it never really matches. But then it's like no one is really stepping up to hold them accountable for that. So that's another issue. But I do agree with what has been mentioned. And it was even like what someone in the audience had mentioned earlier on. Africa is sort of in a place where we're trying to do the most to be the most attractive place. You know, who's got the fanciest airport? Who's got this, and that? And I think it's sort of coming out in a sense that we want to add value to what Africa owns. We want to add value and say that Africa is a beautiful place and we have this, and that. And, you know, it's attractive in its own different ways. But then I feel as though if we start going in that direction, then we're missing out on the bigger picture and we're not making it sustainable enough. And so for me, my major concern would really be if we're talking about young people and we want to invest in Africa, which has got the youngest population in the world, what are we doing, for instance, to ensure that they have entrepreneurial skills that are going to help them compete adequately in this market itself? What are we going to do to ensure that they've got job skills that's going to help them go into the workforce and actually be relevant and add value to the development of Africa? And for me in particular, one of the major issues that I'm really into is in the health sector. Like you mentioned, mosquitoes have got no borders. But then it's also around if Africa is living in a state where they're not healthy, they don't have access to, you know, proper adequate healthcare services, or people don't even realize how important it is to take care of their health, then automatically we're going into a downpour because that's where our wealth will lie in. So therefore, for me, I do agree that there's a lot that we do need to invest in, but I believe it's also just a way of tapping into Africa's great potential and then bringing that out. And the best way to do that is to sort of have this power discussion and find a way to ensure that our leaders are making the right decisions. And I think that's where the conversation is actually.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm going to pick up the first point you made and take that to Winnie, because Natasha's point was in part, you know, you highlighted that the debt that African countries have, but Natasha's first point was actually there are lots of billions there. It's just that leaders are stashing them away in private accounts or squandering them or misallocating them. What do you think? I mean, how does that figure in your, you know, you've told us about the debt problem, and I guess the question is, how do we solve it? And is Natasha's issue part of the solution?
I think the issue of corruption is a serious one. If you take a country like Equatorial Guinea, it has a GDP per capita almost equal to that of Spain. But it has a maternal mortality rate like that of Burundi. So how does that? On the one hand, they have the resources, on the other hand, they have the poorest people. The countries of Africa that grew fastest were also increasing in terms of the numbers of poor people. So there is something there about resource capture and political capture. We need to work on that, on the issue of our resources being used for being plowed back into people. But it's not just the corruption and the political capture. There is also really economic mismanagement, just failing to be able to plan well. If you have growth and it's coming from one resource, say it's oil or gas, at least if you are a good manager, you need to know that I must save some of that and put it into other parts that will raise more money because this oil will go away.
Yeah.
But when it is captured and it is used by a few people, you just get whole areas of marginalization and deepening poverty. That's part of what is happening on our continent. But I wanted also to...
Oh, just on that though, Winnie, can I
Yeah.
just ask you before, because
I
like to
want
look
to
at the bright side. You've watched this continent for many years. Where have you seen that turn around?
There is. You see, in fact, when you look at the countries that struck oil first, that oil was captured. That's the truth. It was captured by a small elite, and poverty just kept worsening. But there is now a second round of countries that have also recently struck oil and gas. We see some more effort towards using that oil in more transparent ways, better legislation around the way the oil resource will be taxed and how the money will be invested, sovereign funds and all that. So we're seeing like the second round include a country like Ghana doing better than the earlier ones, I'm sorry to say, like Nigeria. So, but it's about learning. It's about learning. I mean, I think our people are becoming more empowered and demanding better and better governance. But I'm worried that the third round, I'm not sure. Look at the countries. Our own East African coast is awash with minerals now, with oil and gas. But I'm not sure whether this third round is going to be better than the first and the second round, where we'll see that resource returning to the people through spending on people. I'm not sure, because take a country like Mozambique today. Mozambique, I am part of a broad civil society that is actually has taken the contractors, two companies, two financiers, to court in the UK over the deals that were struck over the resource, the gas, and then the infrastructure to accompany it. Why was that? Because all the rules of proper procurement by the companies were broken. At the same time, the legislation was not respected of contracting or of contracting debt were not followed. So on the one hand, there are the financiers who are corrupt, and then you have some government officials who also broke their own rules. And the result is a huge debt, and we are scratching only at the top. There's some more rot at the bottom. So I think that we are still challenged in terms of the governance of our natural resources, and we are also showing that we are learning, but learning too slowly. The world is not waiting for us. Poverty is increasing, climate change is worsening the situation. Mozambique could not get debt relief because of the hurricanes and the storms that hit them, the floods. Nobody said, okay, because you're suffering from climate change, don't pay back your debt, let's delay repayment. No, they have to pay back, but at the same time they are facing the impacts of climate change. So the world is not waiting for us. Climate change is not going to forgive us. we need to manage better and manage for people.
Can I come to you, Brian? You know, Winnie has depicted the relationship between oil companies and the government in Nigeria as one which is not resulting in benefits for the nation at whole. She's not the only person to make that point. If I just gave you a magic wand for a minute.
And he shouldn't feel that he has to defend.
No,
He's
No,
not the
I'm not
government.
asking him to defend. I'm giving him a magic wand. I'm going to give you a magic wand.
Frankly.
What would you change with a magic wand? What would you change about the relationship between oil companies and government in Nigeria? With a magic wand. I'm
You
not
know, it's very important that we made that statement. Obviously, in Nigeria, we have suffered the so-called resource cost. There is no doubt about it. We have also enjoyed certain first-mover advantages. But there's something happening in the Nigerian oil and gas business which is perhaps not very apparent to people, and that is some revolution that is now happening. The oil business is gradually moving into the private sector hands, and there is a very strong push for indigenous oil companies to actually take the lead, and that's where we've come from in Seplat. Give you an example. In the past 10 years, Nigerian companies could not produce up to 2% of Nigerian oil production. Today, we're producing 15%, 20%, and rising. And when I spoke about the gas revolution in the country, it is more or less being driven by a lot of indigenous play, especially with respect to gas production within the country itself. This is very important. Now, you're beginning to see all of this because there is some regulatory revolution, I must say, where government has done something right with respect to the Nigerian content. It is also on record that in Nigeria today, an indigenous company was involved in coupling an FPSO, several billions of dollars. Those are positive things, but obviously there are still negative things. When I spoke about the need for energy and balancing, what I really am speaking about will impact the entire strata of the Nigerian economy and indeed Africa. The same thing can be replicated. For example, if you provided and closed the gaps in power infrastructure, and I keep referring to Nigeria as a reference point. Today, power generation, 6,000 megawatts of power for over 200 million people. Statistics has it that Nigeria actually needs over 180 megawatts. So it can begin to tell you the gap. And with this gap is a huge amount of investment flow that you can see. And you can also address some of the things that Winnie raised. This issue about investment flow into Africa being only debt should be discouraged.
Exactly.
It should be discouraged from regulatory framework. There is absolutely no reason why this investment flow cannot come in terms of equity. There is no reason why those investment flows cannot come and build factories within Africa, even if those companies are owned by foreigners. It doesn't matter. But let those factories be built in Africa through equity flow rather than debt flow.
Thank you, Brian. So Brian is pointing to some...
And just to conclude, when I spoke about Nigeria diversification, what really, the real impact of that is, when you begin to see energy in Nigeria being, oil and gas being source of energy rather than revenue, once you provide that energy and then empower the end industries, then all of the social funding you are talking about will fall in place. You create jobs. People will be able to then afford health services. They can afford proper education. A lot of things will then happen. People will even become more economically independent, and that will impact.
Thank you. Now we're running fast out of time, and I'm going to ask each panelist. Brian has already led the way. I'll ask the other three to tell us where the green shoots are. Where are the green shoots of hope that they can see progress across the continent over the next year or so? And I just want to underscore Brian's point about indigenous companies, because that's a trend we've seen over the last decade. Take banking. Since the global financial crisis, it's now African banks dominating the continent. Telecoms, it's African telecoms companies, and now you're saying energy companies as well. Sipo, where are the green shoots for you?
Well, I think the youth dividend, there's nothing inevitable about it. We, in a digital era where Africa's population will constitute 25% of the population of the world, 60% of which will be young people, we need to take cognizance of the fact that we're starting from a very poor social infrastructure as far as education and health are concerned. It goes back again to my point. If we share that infrastructure, we could unleash these young people, give them access to education and training that enable them to be meaningful players in a digital era, to mediate technologies from elsewhere and to innovate technologies at home. And they would constitute a major driver of Africa's turnaround.
Thank you, Seplat. Natasha, where are the green shoots for you?
For me, the green shoots are definitely in the fact that if you ask any African today, they're probably more aware of what's going on around them than before. And so for me, that's a really big thing. I feel as though if people are ignorant of what's going on, it's even worse because they don't even understand what the problem is. But the fact that we're able to elaborate and point out what the problem is in this whole diverse room means that we're all able to elaborate and point out what the solution is. So for me, that's a really green light. And then like he's mentioned, the fact that we have such a huge youth bulge in Africa means that there's so much potential. And all we have to do is really just tap into the areas in which will allow us to actually get out this potential and use it to invest in Africa. It's so sad, like she's mentioned. I'm just going to talk a bit more, but then, like she's mentioned, you know, like back home in Zambia, we have 800% is what's going to be invested in our national budgets towards paying back, you know, like the debt. But then if you look at it, it's like a really long-term plan that's been decided by people now. And in 20 years, the people in power who are there now won't be there in 20 years. I will be in power. I will be the one to face the consequences.
Great.
So, you know,
I think that's the green shoot. Natasha in power.
What I mean...
Actually, I'm going to have to stop you because we're running very quickly out of time.
Just a quick one. So the fact that I'm the one who has to face the consequences means that I have to be invested in to be able to manage that. And so my major question is, what are we going to do to invest in this population to be able to handle what has actually taken place, but also ensure that the next generation doesn't suffer the way we are going to?
Terrific. Winnie, green shoots.
Green shoots is people. I too believe that I saw the revolution happening in Sudan, young women leading protests on the street and saying this growth is not benefiting us. We want growth that benefits all of us. We saw them in Egypt. We're seeing many young people coming up and saying we want to see a different model of growth. So that is my hope, people. We have comparative advantage in our agriculture. A large part of it is still smallholder. Deep investment, big investment in it can turn things around and create many jobs. We have the opportunities, but we need to take back power. Yeah. We need to take back power. So I agree with Natasha.
Can I draw this together by pulling out and perhaps adding a couple green shoots in this Africa Outlook this year at Davos, so that the rise of homegrown businesses across the continent, the rise of shared infrastructure and a determination across Africa to lower borders. Natasha and younger people like Natasha running for office and already starting to plan that now. That gives us hope. Agriculture and the fact that technology can now add value to agricultural produce. I have a bag of coffee beans that was produced in a particular part of Yemen, which can be traced. So Africa can use technology to start adding value. And finally, it was implicit in what you said, Winnie, the rise of women across the continent, the Sudan uprising led by women, when we were in South Africa at the South African WEF, there were women out on the street wanting to change laws around domestic violence in South Africa. This is a continent on the move. It's on a move in a pretty difficult world where the rest of Davos is talking about China, United States, but I hope you'll go away optimistic about the green shoots in Africa 2020. Join me in thanking our brilliant panelists. Well done. Pleasure.